Mr. John Nisha. He's with the State Fire Marshal Division. He's now the Bureau Chief. He's going to talk a little bit about the legislation, what pending legislation, what the changes that are coming up, what he expects, and all kinds of good things like that. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll hit you with the questions later. All right. You need anything?
No.
All set?
Set this up over here.
Sure.
One of these people that can't work except from an overhead, so apparently it's connected with my vocal cord somewhere, so I can't talk unless one of those is going. I'd like to keep this as informal as we can. And if you got any questions as we're going through here, please feel free to ask. I do want to give a classic disclaimer. I was giving one of these talks once, and a guy that I'd gone to school with was sitting in the audience, who is now a practicing attorney, and he said, "John, you got to be careful because sometimes you say things that somebody could sue you for harassment or diversity or something like that." So I give the classic disclaimer now. If I say anything that offends anybody in this audience, I wish to apologize beforehand, and I also wish you to understand that as a state employee, I have no money, so there's no. I've got a handout that I'm going to kind of be going along with here. I'm going to pass a few of them around. More than enough, I believe. I want to focus primarily tonight on the changes that we're proposing to the state fire code, which is under review in the adoption process right now. That is one of my jobs that I have with the state. And before I get going too far here, I just want to do a quick survey. I heard most people in terms of introductions. How many of you are in the engineering business? Primarily fire protection engineering? Okay. Sprinkler industry. Okay, you're probably going to like a lot of this. Fire alarm industry. You're going to like parts of this. Any consultants? I know there's at least one. Code officials. Fire code, building code officials. Private industry. Okay, good. Well, you're all going to get a little something of what you like, but I want to talk briefly about legislation pending. As a state employee, one thing that we're always told is you never question the wisdom of the legislature, so whatever they're doing down there apparently is good, or they wouldn't be doing it for us, or to us, and frame of reference. But there's really no major issues out there this year dealing with legislation from a fire protection standpoint. There's the usual fire service pension bills and these kinds of things going on there. But there's really nothing that, that there's no public school inspection program or any sprinkler licensing program or anything like that that's on the horizon looming very large, although there's been tinkering and threats made about carbon monoxide detectors, which is kind of scaring some people right now. But there's nothing written right now, and this is the end of the committee work today, tomorrow, so probably won't be anything introduced this year. There is one that may touch, maybe on the periphery of this group, but there is a movement to legalize fireworks in the state of Minnesota, and we think it's dead. At least it was given its last rites last week, but it could come back on one of the omnibus garbage bills at the 11th hour. So that's a possibility, but there's a growing faction of people that want to legalize fireworks in the state. I think it's kind of interesting. One of the fireworks have been illegal in Minnesota since 1941. One of the bills proposed said that only people with 5 years of experience of shooting off fireworks in the state of Minnesota would be allowed to sell them. So that's like, well, you had to be a cocaine distributor for 10 years in order to do that. Anyway, that's nothing big that we're aware of. So one of the things that was on the agenda, I know, for tonight was about legislation that was pending. There really isn't too much out there. Kind of a peripheral issue that's surfacing, and I know we could probably take a survey in this group and have people line up on both sides of the issue, but somebody that may have caught the TV special that was done last week on Channel 5, may know something about this. And that's kind of this movement about architectural engineering work versus design, and they specifically pulled out sprinklers on several of them and kind of highlighted that. I know there's some professional engineers in here, and you may feel one way and others that feel the other way, but the State Board of Architecture and Engineering, I think is fair to say, is flexing their muscles a little bit, and they want to get more into that. Now, they have fired a letter to us saying, oh, bad choice of terms, they sent a letter to us saying that they think fire alarm installation now is under the purview of engineers. They've always argued that sprinkler work was, and now they're saying fire alarms are too, because it's the application of applied sciences, so therefore they believe it's under the heading of engineering. So that's one that's kind of out there floating around yet, and we may see more action on that. For those of you that followed a few years ago with the sprinkler licensing registration or the sprinkler licensing bill and the rulemaking that went along with that, the administrative law judge in the state threw out that argument and said that the sprinkler design was not designed for the engineering world. It was more application of already written standards, so that it wasn't true design. So that one I don't think that we've heard the last of, so we're probably going to see more of that coming up. A little bit about the state fire code and the process and some of the updates. Let's see if I remembered my, there's one other I wanted to show you here. The state fire code in Minnesota is adopted by a state statute that gives Commissioner of Public Safety, and specifically the State Fire Marshal's Division, the authority. It actually requires us to adopt a statewide fire code. Now, unlike the building code, the fire code is statewide. It applies in every political subdivision within the state. The building code does not. It only applies in certain ones, the metro area, and then typically cities larger than 5,000 or so will adopt it. But the state fire code is applicable statewide. That's a noticeable difference. It's a very big difference between the two codes. Our division has long had an open door policy dealing with the adoption of the code, where we invite outside interests, and we specifically invite the Fire Marshals Association of Minnesota and the Minnesota State Fire Chiefs Association to participate in the process, give us their input, what do they want to see in the code, and so on. So we don't go into some deep, dark back room and write something and all of a sudden just dump it on everybody and here's the new state code. We try to get a lot of involvement. That's one of the reasons I'm here tonight. I've talked to about every major fire service group in the state about the proposals for the fire code that we have on the table right now. We published a notice of intent to adopt, which is a first step in a very cumbersome legal process called the Administrative Procedures Act under Chapter 14 of the state statutes. That's step number one, and that's just saying, hey, public, we're going to do something, and then you're supposed to, if you really think you're going to be aggrieved by it, you're supposed to tell us what you want to see in the code. We've gotten no comments back, which is not unusual. Most people don't pay attention to those legal notices. We met with several of the affected groups, met with several building code official groups. I met with several fire groups. Met with a couple of industry groups on it, not true fire protection, but like LP Gas and Flammable Liquids and some of the other ones. We pretty much finalized the draft right now, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. I didn't bring the whole draft for you. That's about 30 pages, and it's very legalese, and I didn't figure that you really wanted to read it. Of course, if any of you are having trouble sleeping at night and wish something like that to help you get to sleep, I'd be happy to supply it to you, but it's kind of a long, boring exercise. We can get your copy if you really want. We're presently writing what's called the Statement of Need and Reasonableness, which is also part of that rulemaking process, where in essence what we have to do is justify what changes we're proposing to make. I always describe it to people as it explains what we're trying to do, and we try to explain it in common sense language so anybody, even without a fire service background, would understand what we're trying to do. They don't necessarily agree with it. In meeting with a lot of groups, what we found over the years, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this, but this is a photo one of our investigators came across one time. You may be able to see it, but it's a dead critter that got smushed on the road, and then the state crew came by and had to paint the road, and they painted right over the critter. So somehow when that dead critter rots away there, you're going to still see this outline of this dead critter forever and ever when you drive down the highway. And I thought it's kind of fitting because we have a lot of people say, well, adopting the fire code isn't my job. I mean, that's not my job. Just like this guy painting the crew, the painting crew here, it's not my job to scrape the road, I just paint it, you know. Well, it really is all our jobs because it will affect virtually everybody's livelihood to some degree or another in here. And it is something that you have to be involved in and have to get at least a working knowledge on what it is. We don't set out to gore anybody's ox. I mean, we're not setting out to get anybody in this process. But occasionally, when we're trying to do one thing, it may have that effect of stifling something on the other side. So we do need to hear. We need to be involved if something we're doing is particularly onerous or negative to a particular industry. So please speak up. Let us know. If you don't want to talk to me tonight, you can send me a letter or call me on the phone or something later. Like I said, anyone wanting copies of any of the information that we have is free to get it. There's nothing secretive about this. You're not put on a blacklist if you ask for it. We have the National Fire Sprinkler Association is on the mailing list. They get it now, and they have their code experts review it and look at it. There is somebody from the alarm industry representing the Minnesota Burglar and Fire Alarm Association is already on the mailing list and getting this too. So I say we're not trying to do this in a vacuum. The big question that always comes up is that I'm going to talk about a lot of proposals. These are only proposals right now. These are only ideas. And people will want to know, can I use them? Can I use them tomorrow? Because I can tell you, particularly those in the sprinkler industry, you're going to see some of these and you're going to say, I got just the job, I could use this as a deduct tomorrow on, okay? This has not been legally adopted yet, and I need to caution you on that. You can ask the question, and depending on who you have to deal with a code official, they may or may not wish to grant you that, but legally they're not bound to grant you that. As a matter of fact, there may be some legality that they really shouldn't give you some of these yet. So you just need to know that up front. Feel free to ask the question. You may want to propose it under an alternate method of material. That's an acceptable use. You can do that under the code that's right now. You may want to request some of these as a variance, and you had that. I can talk about specifics when I get to those about ones where we've already granted variances on because we think this is going to pass. But this may not pass. As there's an old saying, if a person loves the law and loves sausage, you should never watch either one of them being made. And that's somewhat true about the code business too. It's not always pleasant, and it's not always what we want to see in the end that comes out of that. So if you see specifics, you may be interested. You better ask the question first rather than just going ahead and doing it. And whatever you do is don't go out there and say, well, John from the state told me it was okay to do this, because I'm going to deny that I ever said that. You can ask somebody, but just don't go ahead and do that. One thing that I find very interesting, and this is now, I'm starting my 5th year of doing the code adoption. This is actually the 2nd code cycle that I've been through, because they come out about every 3 years. Well, one thing that you do is, or what you can do when you adopt a code, is to actually incorporate some philosophies, and you can incorporate things that are really working. And you're going to see some of that coming out now. Say some of you will agree with it, some of you will disagree with it. But we're trying to incorporate what we think works from a fire protection standpoint. There's really 3 main schemes in fire protection. There's a couple of subgroups, but you're really into sprinklers, automatic protection, or you're into compartmentation, or you're into some detection, alarm, that kind of technology. You can also talk about kind of as a standalone when you get to human factors. Okay? I can tell you of the 3 and then the 4th human factors, I have absolutely no confidence in the human factors end of it. People will not do the right thing in fire conditions. The history books are full of it. So we're really back to kind of banking on built-in automatic protection. I also personally don't have a lot of faith in compartmentation. And I'm becoming very, very cynical of compartmentation, the theory that you can build firewalls in a building in a whole. One needs only walk around the metro area for a while and see the buildings that were compartmented that are now empty and vacant in a shell because of the major fire that burned in there. And we've had a number of them where the two-hour firewalls didn't hold, the 1-hour firewalls didn't hold. Unfortunately, that's still probably the preferred method by architects. Architects put a lot of faith in compartmentation, and a lot of building officials still think that compartmentation is the best fire protection scheme. Somehow confine it to this room or this area of a building or something, and we're really not seeing that that's working in the real world where the rubber meets the road. And the class example, and I'll use that over and over again tonight, was Burnsville High School. That was the highest type of construction. That was a school constructed like virtually none other in the state. It was the highest type of construction, and $15 million worth of fire later, they had to overhaul it. So, compartmentation, fire-resistant construction in and of itself doesn't work. It's too easy to compromise it. So we're able to incorporate some of these things that we see are working. Kind of a little segue into my next comment here. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. I don't do this to pick on a fellow state regulatory agency, but this does give you some idea. I just got done reading a book called The Death of Common Sense. Has anybody else read it here? I would encourage anybody, particularly in the code enforcement business or maybe the engineering business, you should maybe read it. It's very interesting. It talks a lot about codes and how codes have lost touch with what they were out there to protect, what they're trying to do. And we have to make a fire code that's reasonable, practical, and enforceable in the state of Minnesota. And whether you like it or not, where the rubber meets the road is out there with people who are trying to enforce it in the end run. And if you keep tacking on redundancy after redundancy after redundancy, pretty soon you'll find out you're losing it. It's not doing it. There's a difference between increasing the level of fire and life safety in the building and complying with the code. They're two separate and distinct philosophies. And I think our philosophy should be to increase the fire and life safety in the building, not merely code compliance. We're having this conversation right before supper with a couple of people. We've had major buildings burn right to the ground that were fully code compliant, but they didn't have a reasonable level of fire safety. Okay, so there is a difference. For years, and for those of you who, and I know I'm probably not going to make any friends here tonight, but I know that there's some of you in the business that don't own a code book. I know that to be true. Some of you, they're still in plastic. Never open it up. But for those of you who have looked in the code books over the years, you'll notice, particularly with the building codes and fire codes, that they have just grown and grown and grown. Right now, I started, the first code I started with was a 73 edition of the code, and right now we have chapters in the fire code that are longer than that whole code was. So we're just seeing, it's kind of like coat hangers at night. They must just proliferate in the closet. And the same thing is true with codes. We've gone from a code that was a few hundred pages in length to now the fire code is 600, 800 pages, 600 and some pages, something like that. And they increase the size too. So there's more print on a page than there used to be. So we're finding this getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And typically what that is adding requirements. More and more and more requirements. To the point now where we have a duplication, we have a belt and suspenders approach, and just to be safe to the belt and suspenders, we've added a rope and a bungee cord. We're just going to make sure that the pants don't fall down. Okay? Well, that's really, in a lot of cases, overkill. It's over-designed, and we're seeing a movement. You've heard talks about this in your group before, about the movement towards performance-based fire protection, performance-based codes. And we're going to start to see more and more of that coming as the codes get more and more sophisticated. I was reading an article in Building Standards magazine, which is the journal, basically the International Conference of Building Officials, that says 10 years. And it's not in their vested interest to see it. I mean, they're not ones that are out promoting it. It's going to take away from them, but they're saying 10 years it's going to be here. So, since a lot of you have a sprinkler tie here, I want to talk about another emerging belief or an emerging philosophy that's coming out of the sprinkler industry. or coming out from the sprinkler industry. And fire is a progression, and fire grows in geometric proportions when we talk about T-squared fires. They basically go from being 2 square feet to 4 square feet to 16 square feet to whatever 16 by 16 is. It's beyond my mathematical capability standing here. But fire grows exponentially. It's growing in that kind of size to the point that it reaches flashover. If you can keep a fire to pre-flashover conditions, you're going to go a long ways to saving the rest of the people in the building. Now, if I'm sitting here alone in this room and I do something stupid and ignite this room on fire, there's a good chance I'm going to die anyway because I'm intimately involved in the ignition. But if you can keep the fire from spreading out of this room or spreading to any large degree within this room, you're going to do a lot to save the other people in this building. That's right now the philosophy, the emerging trend on sprinklers is they're keeping them pre-flashover. And if you can keep the fire to pre-flashover conditions, it's not till flashover that it's producing enough toxic products of combustion that it's imperiling the other people in the building. So you're going to see a lot more emphasis on sprinklers, and a lot more the codes are going to be pushing that way, even though you've heard some comments that there's a lot of detractors out there that don't want it. Frankly, it's the only thing that's working right now in terms of building construction, because the 1-hour walls aren't working on it. Guarantee you that. Okay, you've got a handout in front of you. I'm going to kind of walk through this. I'm not going to go over all this because it doesn't. A lot of it probably doesn't affect this group. I always like to throw up. I got a real sick sense of humor, and this guy is one of the few that's even more warped than I am. So I like to throw up some of Gary Larson Farside comics every now and then. He likes to do stuff on fire. Here's our new treatment for arsonists. Okay, we're proposing to adopt the 94 edition of the Uniform Fire Code. We have, since the beginning that we've had a fire code in the state of Minnesota going back to 1975, we've always adopted by reference the Uniform Fire Code. That's one of 4 fire codes that are published nationally throughout the state. They're pretty much geographic in nature, and this particular one comes out of the West Coast, and basically everybody, this is an oversimplification, but basically everybody west of Mississippi, if they adopt a fire code, it's the Uniform Fire Code. So we're pretty consistent with the folks west of us. We're not very consistent with the folks east of us. For those of you who might do work in Wisconsin, they have their own code. If you go down to Illinois, they have what's called the VOCA code. If you go down south, there's a Southern Fire Prevention Code. And out on the East Coast, there's NFPA 1. NFPA is Fire Prevention Code. So those are the 4 fire codes that there are. We have the Uniform Fire Code. It's probably the biggest in terms of geography. I don't know if it's the biggest in terms of actual users, but it is very heavily used by the most number of states. They completely revised the 94 Fire Code, just like they completely revised the 94 Building Code. They're going to a common code format. All the codes are going to look the same, basically. Not necessarily going to have the same requirements in them, but they're going to look the same. If you want to find exiting, it's all going to be in chapter whatever in all these codes. So no matter what code you're using, you're going to be able to go anywhere in the country and I open up to chapter 9 and it's fire protection, whatever. So it's a common code format, common numbering system. They're going to the numbering system that's used by NFPA. So for those of you who like the NFPA numbering system, you're going to like the new code format. For those of you that don't like it, you're not going to like it, but get used to it because it's here anyway. So it's a series of numbers and periods and more numbers and periods and so on, rather than the kind of the Roman numeral type outline format that the Uniform Code had before. One of the proposals we're going to slap in, or we're proposing to put in, is one dealing with appeals to the State Fire Marshal's Office. This is one area that's probably grown. We get more appeals than we used to, more requests for variance. We're going to try to put something in there, putting a timeline on. What we do is have people that sit on these things for a year, and then just when we start to turn the heat up on them that they're supposed to comply, then they say, oh, well, we want to appeal it, and that stops the whole process and puts you back to square one. And we've had a couple of them thrown out of court because people did that. And that's kind of the exception rather than the rule, but we want to put in language right there to put a specific window on appeal so these things don't drag out too long. There's a number of definition changes we're proposing to put in there. Now let me back up for a second. On the handout you have, you see on the section there, some of those have an asterisk after them. If it's got an asterisk after them, that means it's a proposed state amendment. If it doesn't have the asterisk after it, that was a change that's going to take place in the base code. And this isn't all the changes, but it's the major changes, just see kind of the big ones. We're going to put in a bunch of definitions here. We've never had the term aisle defined and it's used. Automatic fire detector, that's used extensively throughout the alarm requirements, so we're going to add a definition in there. It's basically smoke, heat, flame, all encompassing. Corridors and rooms, we're going to amend some definitions that we need for other purposes in there. Most of this doesn't won't directly affect you. One that will, some of you will love this, I think everyone in this room will love this one. So, this was my idea. Since you like it, I came up with this. If you hate it, it was somebody else's idea. We're going to add requirements in the code for annual inspection and testing of fire protection systems, sprinklers and alarms. Right now the code says that the inspection requirements, the inspection times are up to the local fire official, and we have fire officials going from every 6 months it should be looked at, every 50 years it should be looked at. Well, we think on fire protection systems once a year is a minimum. If they want to adopt a local ordinance that says every 6 months in town, they can do that too. But we want these systems looked at. We found, since we got into the school inspection business in 1990, we had fire alarm systems that had never been looked at since they were put in, ever. And we find that with sprinklers too, but sprinklers tend to be newer systems, and they've only been ignored for 10 years rather than 50 years. So we're going to put in annual testing. That'll clear up the discretionary language that's now in the code. So, and then if you have other fire protection systems and equipment, if you're dealing with some kind of halon or some other fixed type of extinguishing system, you end up going almost to manufacturer's recommendations in those types of situations. And that's still discretionary. It kind of depends. Another one that, another change that we're making, the way the code reads right now, for the standard for the installation of sprinkler systems, automatic fire extinguishing systems, it calls them, it kicks you into Uniform Building Code Standard 9-1. That is essentially a reprint of NFPA 13, although it would be the 91 edition, and then there's a bunch of amendments that are made to it. We're saying, hey, the whole industry uses NFPA 13, and it typically uses the most current edition of it, so we're going to adopt by reference NFPA 13, the 94 edition. Okay. The insurance companies are at it. I know all the contractors are doing it now, so let's just get in sync with everybody else. Then we're going to put, yeah.
Just use the latest edition.
Well, we can't, because by this Administrative Procedures Act, we have to adopt a specific edition. We have to name it, and so we have to name the year that it's published and everything else. So we would love to do that, because then we wouldn't have to go through this whole process, but they want us to go through this whole process. So,
Getting back on that inspection on the last thing, if a fire protection system is not required, it's there, does it have to be, would it have to be, have you addressed that?
yes, and that was a long discussion, what happens when you have a voluntary system.
Yeah.
We've taken the approach that you have to treat them as a system. Somebody's relying on them, whether it's the fire department or whether it's the occupant. So
We ran into that problem in California.
yeah, and it's kind of a catch-22, because really the option, and the property owner could say this and say, fine, I'm just going to take it out. But I don't know of too many people that would take it out rather than maintain it. I suppose there's a few out there, but we think even voluntary systems should be maintained. I can tell you, it wasn't a unanimous decision. There was a lot of debate like that before. Because of the reliance that primarily the fire department puts on them, we thought that should come to maintenance. The other thing that we're looking at doing, and this gets back to my comment earlier about philosophies, one of the philosophies that's coming out of this code very long and hard, and it's not by accident, is we want to see more emphasis on automatic systems, be they either sprinklers or alarms. We have the faith in them. We don't have the faith in compartmentation and some other things. So the next change is one to encourage sprinkler systems. We are going to allow the fire chief to modify the hose stream allowances in NFPA 13 if you're in an area of limited water supply. We've run into a number of situations, primarily when you get outstate, where you've got enough water to sprinkler the building, but you run flat into that 250-gallon hose stream allowance and you can't do it. And this gets into one of those death of common sense kind of issues. There is no water supply for the fire department to starve from because it's all a self-contained water supply. The fire department brings their own water. Okay, we've seen the hose stream kill a number of sprinkler systems, a number of buildings that should have gotten sprinkled. So we're going to say, okay, the chief can modify the hose stream allowance. Maybe you only got half of what you need. Maybe you only got a quarter of what you need. Maybe you bring your own water, whatever, but we'll leave that up to the local fire chief to be able to modify the hose stream allowance. That's going to encourage some buildings to get sprinkled right now that aren't getting sprinkled. So we think that's a positive move. NFPA caught wind of that and did not like it. I can tell you, they called me up. The 13 committee did not like us doing that, but we said, hey, we'd rather have half a loaf than no loaf at all. So there's people that are going to watch how this one develops. There's a proposal that's in the base code, or a change that was in the base code this year. I've got it under section 1003.2.4 on page 2 of your handout. 1003.2.4 deals with fire extinguishing systems in schools. It now is identical to building code. It's saying if you build a new school, you have to sprinkler it, and it puts two exceptions in. It says, well, we didn't really mean that. If you have direct exits out of each classroom, which we don't have very often in Minnesota, there's only one school I know of built that way, then you don't have to sprinkler it. And if you want to subdivide the building into 20,000 square foot compartments using 2-hour fire-resistant construction, you can get around sprinkling it. In talking to what I consider some of the good architect and engineering firms in the state, they said, we can't afford to do that. But we still got some of the smaller architectural firms that think that's a good option and will do that. The bigger ones are saying we're just going to sprinkler it. It's cheaper than trying to bust the building up with 2-hour rated firewalls. But there's still what I call some of the smaller firms that maybe don't do a lot of schoolwork. They think they can do that with 4 layers of sheetrock and it's going to be real cheap. And they can, technically, but the kids will kick holes in those right away. The good architects build them all with brick anyway because they know the kids are going to kick them up. So that's one that's shown in the code. But clearly the intent of the code here was to get the public schools sprinkled and get school buildings sprinkled. Clearly the intent was. The exceptions were added to accommodate some very unique situations. The next one I want to talk about is 1003.281. I'm not going to cover everything that's on here because we'll be here until midnight or better, but this has to deal with area separation walls and R1 occupancies. We're saying for purposes of sprinkler protection, area separation walls don't form separate buildings. Now R1 occupancies are multiple residential buildings, motels, hotels, apartment buildings. What we're seeing here is the code now says if you exceed, depending on whether it's motel, hotel, or apartment, but if you exceed 15 or 20 units, 16 or 20 units, depending on which one it is, you need to sprinkler that. What we're seeing a lot of people do is put 16 units or 15 units, a 2-hour wall, another 15, 2-hour wall, another 15, say, well, they're separate buildings, so I don't have to sprinkler it now. And this chain of buildings will go on forever. Okay, we don't think that's the intent of the code because the code has always said area separation walls may form separate buildings, not will form separate buildings. There's a difference. And we're just going to put it in here for purposes of sprinkler protection, area separation walls in these multiple residential do not form separate buildings. So you don't chop the building up to get around sprinkling it. Then we're going to put an exception in there which will allow 4-hour area separation walls with no openings or penetrations. So basically you'd almost have to be built like on a zero lot line type of concept. And to get a 4-hour wall, the only 4-hour wall I know of is out of masonry. We're pretty much talking about 12-inch block. There is some cavity type things that you can build. And this has to be, area separation walls are basically vertical. They go from floor to roof deck.
Parapeted.
Not parapeted. They don't necessarily have to parapet. You can stop at the roof line now if you have a non-combustible roof. In the old days, you had to parapet it, but you don't necessarily have to anymore. There's a few options to get around that. But the true intent of the old area separation walls were maximum fire loss walls. It's going to hold the fire right there. It's not going to spread beyond that. You can build a 2-hour wall out of 4 layers of sheetrock. 4 hours of sheetrock does not hold back a full-scale fire really ripping. It just isn't going to do that. So it'll hold it for a while, but not. There's a whole bunch of other problems dealing with the tests. There's different tests for sheetrock than there is for masonry, which is to get the ratings. Kind of another unusual little quirk in the codes. The next one, section 1003.3. deals with sprinkler system security monitoring alarms. A whole bunch of changes are going to take care of this section. This is where I think the alarm people are going to like it, the sprinkler people are not, but just wait a minute because that'll reverse here in a little bit. But, the first one is, this used to be in the code and somehow it disappeared, but we're going to put it back in the code. All sprinkler control valves have to be secured in the open position. 13 has waffled on that in the last few editions and actually said, well, you don't have to secure them if they're alarmed and stuff. Well, tamper alarms are not treated by the alarm monitoring companies, at least with a lot of alarm monitoring companies, with the same level of involvement as a water flow alarm. And somebody shuts the valve, sometimes that just comes in as a tamper and they try to call somebody. If they don't get somebody, they send a letter, but that's really about the end of it. So we think all sprinkler control valves should be secured in the open position. We'll do some exceptions if they're in a locked room and there's limited access and that kind of thing. That's equal to it. But the chain and the lock is cheap protection, even if they have a tamper alarm on it, the valves. And I've always been an advocate of this. I think the valve should be locked open no matter what. And I know a couple of the insurance companies aren't too crazy about that. They want the fire department to be able to shut them down real quick. But we got bolt cutters that we can shut those valves down pretty quick if we need to. We're going to modify the requirements for monitoring the sprinkler flow alarms. Right now, with the exception of some institutional occupancies, the hospitals, nursing homes, which are at 20 heads, everything else is at 100 sprinkler heads and need to be monitored. We're going to change that. We're considering in certain types of occupancies that the sprinkler system is acting as a life safety device. And when it's acting as a life safety device, then the monitoring should take place at a lower threshold, because that's going to generate a call to the fire department and have them respond to it. So we're going to change it if it's 20 more sprinklers in an educational occupancy, which is a Group E, in institutional, hospitals, nursing homes, some of the larger supervised living facilities, jails, prisons, those types of facilities. 20 heads or more needs monitoring. And now the Group R Division 1, which will be that's the motels, hotels, apartment buildings. 20 or more heads get into monitoring of those. I know that's going to be a change. But, we are starting to develop a history. As sprinklers are working, we're also getting a problem with sprinkler activation where the water flows. Fire happens Friday night. We've had this in 6 schools and it's real frustrating. Fire happens Friday night. Sprinklers put out the fire, hold it, confine it to the object of origin. The water flows till Monday morning when the janitor gets there and opens the door, and we've got a full-scale swimming pool now. And of course, the first thing the superintendent says is the damn sprinklers, And the sprinklers did their job, but there was a lot of water damage. So we're going to reduce the thresholds here and try to catch those where we're seeing the water run longer than we think it has to. And then in other types of occupancies, monitoring is based on either the number of sprinkler heads, being 100 or more, or the size of the building. What's driving this one is the use of extended covered sprinkler heads. Because basically you can protect twice as much area. That's an oversimplification, but you basically protect twice as much area as you used to be able to. So you could have 2 identical buildings here, one with 99 sprinkler heads and one with 200 in there. One would have to be monitored and the other wouldn't. That's not fair. The only difference is, there's no difference in the hazards, the only difference is the type of heads they're using. So we're going to say, if you're in a light, ordinary, or extra hazard exceed this size in terms of square footage, or 100 sprinkler heads, whichever is more restricted, you need to monitor it. The hazard's the same. What's magical about these numbers? We took the old area coverage per sprinkler and multiplied it by 100. There's nothing scientific, about these. We took the old 200 square feet, which used to be light hazard for a long time. We get over 100 of them, which would be 20,000 square feet. So there's nothing magical about those numbers. That's the logic behind them. It was just easy, because under the old requirements, that's what it would have been at 100 heads. So I can remember when I first got into this code enforcement business, I thought, boy, the people that write this stuff must be real geniuses. And now I am one, and you find out how really there's nothing necessarily magic about this. You just grab what you think is a good idea at the time. Another one that will affect some of you here in this room deals with sprinkler emissions. As people are becoming more liability conscious, we're seeing fewer and fewer code officials willing to stick their neck out and say, you don't have to sprinkler here. I mean, they're pretty much sticking close to the book. The book is saying you need to. Unless the book says you can exempt it or omit it, the code official is going to require that it be there. Some of you will like some of these, some of you may disagree with them, but this is what we're proposing to go ahead with anyway. We're going to add language to exempt sprinkler protection in the following locations. Number one, top of elevator shafts. It does no good to put a sprinkler head on top of an elevator shaft. The shaft is 80 to 90% obstructed with the car anyway. We don't have a problem with elevator cars catching on fire. We don't have a problem with the top of elevator shafts catching on fire. We have a problem down the pit, where all the stuff accumulates. NFPA 13, since the 91 edition, has required sprinkler protection in the pit. We're going to exempt the top of the shaft and just get rid of it. In machine rooms of traction type elevators, the cable drum ones that are up in the penthouse on top of the building, this has been that age-old debate: you sprinkler elevator equipment rooms or don't you? And that, some of you have been in that removing and installing sprinkler heads. I don't know, we kind of joked about it, and we thought you should put them on a quick connect just so you can take them in and out easier. I can remember when a certain elevator inspector was still in business and I was a local fire marshal, I used to say, pipe it in, hide it behind the sheetrock wall. After he signs off the elevator, come back and screw the head in there. Well, he got wise to that one after a while, so we couldn't get away with that anymore. But we're going to try to take care of the traction type elevators. The hydraulic ones are still kind of out there in a little bit of a never land, although the elevator code is going to take care of that one, we think. But there's some very good reasons for the traction type elevators to not ever want water on those. And that really can screw up the braking system. And when those brakes work, they have to work. They have to work now. And also some of the controllers in there. Some of the logic we had behind this is these are typically on top of the building, and you're virtually all on top of the building. We don't have a fire loss in these types of elevators. We don't have the machine rooms catching on fire up on top of the roof. And even if they did, they're on top of the building, they're not under the building. Fires burn up, they rarely burn down, so we think that this is a reasonable level of protection here and takes care of some of the safety issues that are related to the elevator cars, elevator safety also. This is not true in the hydraulic ones. We happen to think that you should sprinkler the hydraulic rooms because they end up being storage rooms. I've personally been to 4 elevator fires in elevator and mechanical rooms, all in the hydraulic rooms and elevators, because somebody stored stuff in there and they ended up having a fire, sure enough. The elevator inspectors tell me I'm wrong, we've never had one in there. We pulled our records, we had it was about 45 of them in a 4-year period or something. So it's not an event that never happens. It does in fact happen. With the advent of Phase 1, Phase 2 recall on all elevators, which is coming, it'll be easy to put in the shunt trips now and make those work. And then above swimming pools. I think this is a common sense one, but we had code officials saying, I can't exempt above the swimming pool because the code doesn't allow me. Okay, we'll let the code allow it now. So the area above the swimming pool, don't need the sprinkler. We just don't have a history of swimming pools spontaneously catching on fire. This hasn't been a real big problem. We have a corrosion problem with heads that are installed there. So there's some good logic to exclude that or exempt that area from it. So still would be some perimeter protection would be required because those pools end up being multi-purpose rooms, and there's more than just swimming pools going on in a lot of them. But at least above the pool itself, make some exemptions. Anybody from northern Minnesota here? Born and raised up north? You'll appreciate this one. One of the other areas that we have found to be a big impediment, for those of you who are in the alarm industry, hang with me because we're coming to you in a minute. We're still in sprinklers, but right now one of the things we found that's been an impediment to sprinklers, another impediment to sprinklers along the hose stream demand, has been standpipes, primarily on combination systems. Depending on which code official you talk to, you need either 65 or 100 pounds at the top of standpipes. I agree. You're shaking your head. Right? First of all, this goes back to that common sense test. When you're talking about a Class 1 or a Class 3 standpipe, that is designed as a fire department use standpipe. If a firefighter is going to hook onto one of those, they better have one of those big red trucks down in the street, and if they need more pressure, they should be going like this to the throttle on the side of the truck. What we're seeing happen is because of that 65 or 100 pound requirement, depending on which code official you talk to, that is automatically driving the fire pump into buildings, even 2 or 3 stories in height, because most cities can't come up with that kind of pressure, even at 65. Well, when you get a combination standpipe sprinkler system, and you have to put a fire pump in, and those of you in the industry know it better than I do, to compensate for that, for the price of the pump, you're going to downsize the piping. Smaller piping goes in, you got more pressure, you got more water available because it's pumped. Well, now you have a device in there that could fail. Fire pumps do fail. They have one of the highest rates of failure of any fire protection device in terms of sprinkler. So you have a system that's under-designed to work without a pump. Right? So we think that that's kicking people when they're down. People that sprinkler a building should not get penalized because there's a requirement for combination sprinkler standpipe in there. And that's overkill. Those pumps are very expensive, as we know. So we're going to allow a reduction in pressure at the top of the standpipe of the building sprinkler. This will only apply to low and mid-rise buildings. When you get into high-rise, this won't apply. High-rise are kind of a special animal, and we want to keep this in. But if you've got a combination sprinkler standpipe system and your sprinkler demand is for sprinkler flow requirements, 25 psi, that's all you need to supply. You won't need the 65 or 100 pounds. Like I said, the fire department should be there hooking into this and supplying it if you get into that kind of situation anyway. So, yeah.
You got the fire low rise and high rise?
Yeah, it's defined in the code by 75 feet above fire department, lowest fire department access. Basically, above a 6-story building, you probably need a high rise. Now, for those of you in the sprinkler industry, if you like that, you'll probably love this. We're going to eliminate requirements for Class 2 systems in sprinkler buildings. Class 2 are the occupant use hose cabinets. Get rid of them. That's encouraging people to do the wrong thing. That's encouraging people to fight the fire. That's not what we want them to do. We want them to pull the alarm. We want them to get out. We want them to call 911 and let the guys in the goofy suits take care of the problem. Okay? That's but putting standpipes in, then people think, well, I have to fight the fire. No. Okay? The standpipes aren't there. They won't try it. So. Besides, I don't trust that hose in most cases any farther than I can throw it. So, Phil.
Would that apply to buildings where there's high rack storage, where there's 1.5 hose stations?
No, there is one exception that's staying in, and that's if in these types of storage occupancies, and also some industrial that may have a fire brigade, that would be the one where Class 2 may stay in.
Okay.
The rest of them we're proposing to take it out.
How about detention? Comes out of detention too?
Yeah, if it's sprinkled, we're proposing it comes out of detention too. I don't remember on the unsprinkled where it's sitting in detention, but it's sprinkled, you can take it out.
See, that's another one though with Class 1, where you have the requirement for the Class 1 hose station on either side of area separation walls in detention. You've got to have the 65 or 100 pounds, even on a single story
Yeah, we'll fix
building.
that too.
Will you?
Yeah.
Please?
I think that's going away, Joe.
Is it?
I think
What, the pressure requirement's going away or
No,
no?
No, it's,
Oh.
I remember right.
yeah, I think we pull that one out of there too. Now, interestingly enough, is the building officials have asked us for a lot of input on standpipes. That's one where they want to rewrite their standpipes, and they're really giving serious look to this, because they know the standpipe requirements in the code are way, way outdated. Way outdated. They know it's time to bring it up in the 1900s, if not maybe the next century. So, we also eliminate the requirements for Class 2 standpipes in most non-sprinkler buildings. This would be the ones that might have, like I said, a fire brigade. They may have to stay in there because that's what the fire brigade uses. But and a lot of others. There was a change in the code. Well, actually, no, the code stayed the same. We always amended the standpipe definitions, and we always required them to be connected to a water supply. But technically, if you read the code, a Class 1 standpipe system did not have to be connected to a water supply. So we're going to stay with the code definitions. So basically now we'll have 3 classes. Class 1 will be the dry standpipes. Class 2 is occupant use. And Class 3 is fire department use. And that will require both the 1.5 and 2.5 inch adapters on the outlets. So before that, there really was no difference between a Class 1 and a Class 3 other than the adapter. That's the only difference between the old Class 1 and Class 3 because of our amendment. Now we're just going to try to simplify it. We're also going to change the height requirement from 3 to 4 stories for the base requirements for standpipes to kick in if the building's sprinkled. 4 stories before you need it. If it's 3 stories, you won't need it in a sprinkled building. Let's see if we did anything else with the sprinklers here. This is one I have to give last rights. For many, many years, this is one of my pet peeves in the code. For many, many years, it's been a requirement for basement pipe inlets. Has anyone in this room ever seen a basement pipe inlet? Neither have I. But the code's very specific on what they have to look like. Nobody ever enforces it. It was based on the old cellar nozzles that fire departments had. Most fire departments don't even carry them anymore. If they do, they just use them for car fires now. They knock a hole in the hood of the car and drop the cellar nozzle, and then it's the first thing to burn off is your inside hood release, the plastic. So that's the only thing you use cellar nozzles for anymore. Nobody even knows what basement pipe inlets are. So we're going to take it out of the code. So give it its last rights, and it'll be dead and gone with this addition. Okay, switching gears here now to your alarm folks. 1007.211. This is another one. We've seen a lot of buildings come in and they have plans. It's a fully sprinkled building. They also put an alarm system in. They put heat detection in within 3 feet of the sprinkler head. That's the Department of Redundancy department. Okay? That's redundant protection. You don't need it. Sprinklers activate by heat also. So we're going to put it in the code. This is another one. We had engineers and we had code officials say, well, the code doesn't tell me I can exempt it, so I'm going to require it to be there. So we're going to exempt it. If the building's sprinkled, you won't need heat detection. They do the same thing. They operate on the same principle anyway. One that came about in the code this time around, it's in the base code that comes out, is if you have a Group A occupancy, which is assembly, and you have over 300 people in it, you need a fire alarm, but it only needs to be a manual system, and then it's connected to a voice evacuation system. I don't know how many of you have ever heard one of those, but a fire emergency has been discovered in the building. Please move to the nearest exit and leave the building, kind of thing. Well, we find that somewhat problematic because if you think about every Group A occupancy that's over 300 people, that's a lot of buildings, including most churches. We don't have a life loss history of people dying in churches on 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. Okay? That's not when it's happening. Church fires happen, and I have to be careful how I say this. Church fires happen at dark 30 in the morning to the work of arsons. Okay? But we just don't have a body count from people dying in church fires. Now, the last time I made that statement, Minneapolis had a church fire that night, so I'm really cautious about making that statement. I made it publicly, and then that arsonist got that church down on the south side of Minneapolis. So we're going to change that code requirement, and we're going to say you need automatic systems in here, not manual. Manual's the wrong thing where you have lots of people together. We want automatic with detection in selected areas. Then we spell out the areas where it's required. We're going to add an exception for churches and buildings used for similar worship purposes. We just don't have a body count in those, whether you like it or not. We have lots of problems in churches, but fires on Sunday morning isn't one of them. We're going to add an exception for sprinkled buildings, because once again, this is requiring automatic detection. We already excluded automatic if the building's sprinkled. We think the sprinklers can do the same type of job. And then add language specifying where detection is required. Storage rooms, kitchens, those types of things. Where the fires are starting in these Group A occupancies, that's where we want the alarm protection. Not necessarily in the big assembly room, because if the fire starts in this room when we're all sitting here, somebody's going to get up and say, at least those of you who are still awake are going to get up and say, there's a fire over there, let's everyone get out. Okay, there's really no need for automatic detection in this type of setting. We know if the room's on fire, we can see it. It's the rooms that you can't see is where the fires are happening. So those types of rooms, and then delete all the requirements related to voice evacuation systems and Group A occupancies. That would drive one into this building we're sitting in. And if we didn't amend the code, we'd have to have a voice evac in this building. Think about it. Is it really necessary? So, because I'm sure there's over 300 occupants. Bob?
What was the number that you came up with, John, when you do put it back in for AIDS? Is it 1,000?
No, we didn't. We completely took it off, and we went to the automatic rather than the...
But the voice feedback, I thought we had...
Nope, we didn't put under no conditions. It's not in there anymore. Obviously, they can do it if they want to from a design standpoint, but the code isn't required. Another change, and this one, believe it or not, this is one, I proposed this with some trepidation, and everybody kind of jumped on this one, so I think I must be able to read crystal balls or something now. Can't believe that this one was actually accepted by a lot of people, including the fire service, which I didn't necessarily think would go. We're going to put requirements in there for both automatic and manual fire alarm systems in schools. We've had manuals in there for a while. We used automatics as kind of an alternate. We used it as a trade-off in a lot of terms. But the code hasn't out and out required automatics in schools. We're going to say, okay, we want to see the automatics in there. Then we're going to delete the requirements for manual pull stations if the building has other fire protection in it. Okay, if the building is sprinkled, you get rid of manual pull stations, other than a couple that you may need for staff activation. The reality is 99.9% of the time, if the pull station's pulled in schools, it's because a kid wants to get out of a task or wants to disrupt the school. They're not pulled because there's a fire in there. So the school officials like this. They want to get rid of the false alarms. They want to get rid of the disruptions. Fire departments want to get rid of these because that cuts down on their false alarm and responses. And you really track the history of fire protection in schools. They said, okay, manual pulls back in the 1940s and 50s was all the fire protection there was in the school. That's all you had. Well, now with the automatic systems, there's really, really much less need to have a manual system in there anymore. So, get rid of it if it's sprinkled. If it's just detectored throughout with smoke detection, you'd still need it in certain hazardous areas, shops, labs, kitchens, and so on. If it's sprinkled, you could do away with all of it except the office or the janitor's maintenance area or something like that for staff activation and fire drills. But in the rest of schools, if it's just like a smoke detection system, you'd still need it in the hazardous areas where you want to get out in a hurry and you want to notify people. There's probably a fast development fire in there. So, and then we'd specify locations where detection is required, and I gave you a laundry list on your handouts. 1007-242 talks about where they're required in Group B occupancies, laundry rooms, boiler rooms, furnace, and so on. This just says, the way the code's written, it says automatic detection. So it could be either smoke or heat. It's kind of up to the designer there, whatever's appropriate. Obviously, if it's sprinkled, then they already have that exception for heat detection. So if it's an area where it's heat detected, or they're proposing to use heat detectors, but it's already sprinkled, they wouldn't have to. I don't know if any of you are fans of horses here. Smoke detection requirements in Group R, Division 3, which are single-family homes. We're putting language requiring single-station detectors adjacent to sleeping areas. That's basically in there right now. It's in the state statute. We're going to put it in the code so you don't have to go one place to find it. If it's constructed after August 1st of '89, this is also state statute. It's required to be hardwired. It has been for a number of years. For new construction, which will be after the effective date of this code, detectors must be hardwired and have battery backup. That's consistent with the building code, which has had those same requirements in there since March of '95 when they were formally adopted. And then we're getting rid of our old spacing rules on smoke detectors in homes, and we're just going to go with some generic language that detectors have to be installed in accordance with manufacturer's recommendations, which is ceiling or 4 to 12 inches down on the sidewall, basically, for most of them. And we've got some rules right now that kind of conflict with that because we actually wrote the rules before any manufacturers had requirements. They're obsolete rules now, so we got to get rid of them. 1007-3332, sounds like a phone number now. This is a change made in the base code. It's on page 4 of your handout. They're going to a common alarm signal now. It will be a temporal pattern. That's, see how well I can do this, but it kind of goes dot, 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 and then stops for a period of time, and dot, dot, dot. There's a reason for that, and that's other types of signals, particularly constantly sounding signals, people become tone deaf to them, basically. They can ignore them. It's like the old alarm clocks going off in the house. You can keep sleeping right through that if you decided to. Whereas a pulse tone, you can't do that anymore, or it's more difficult to do it. And they also want a temporal pattern so that people can talk while the alarm is sounding. You have a little window of time there where you can give instructions to people that may need them. Fire departments like it because they can actually talk on the radio when the alarm's going off. That's historically been a problem. You can't communicate with the other people in the fire ground because of the alarm. So they're going to a universal system. This will only apply to new systems. It's not going to be retroactive. But anything new now being installed as a temporal pattern. We've been telling people for the last 3-4 years to gear up for this. It's coming. Those of you in the industry, you probably know this, but it's probably long overdue. I don't know if you've ever been in, I was staying out in Howard Johnson's out in New Jersey one time, and the alarm went off, and I honestly didn't know what that noise was. I had no idea it was a fire alarm, so it'll go a long ways to standardizing fire alarm signals in the country, too. Fire-resistant construction, 1112.1. We used to adopt, as part of the code, we used to adopt NFPA's life safety code. We're not proposing to do that this time, so we're going to make some tweaking in the code to pick up those requirements that we would miss by not having 101. This is one of them. Allows, we're going to put an amendment in there for fire-resistant construction has to be installed and maintained. Right now the code just says maintained and it conforms to the building code. We're going to say installed also, which we used to have to go to NFPA 101 to get those requirements. Now we'll have it in one book. We don't have to jump around. Same with the next issue dealing with interior finish. Stuff to put on the walls and ceilings. And require that it be installed and maintained in accordance with the building code. I'm going to do some changing to the exits requirements. Same basic philosophy. Exits have to be installed and maintained in accordance with the building code. That way we don't need the 101 again. We'll get down to a couple books. One on exit obstructions. This is kind of a new change. Because our code comes out of the West Coast, they don't have a big problem with snow. We do. We're going to require that all exits have to be maintained unobstructed, including accumulation of snow and ice. We have a lot of school buildings out there right now that the exits are set up for 600 people, and all they shovel is a 42 by 42 inch stoop outside the door. That's not going to hardly handle 600 people in that. So you really need to maintain the exits. Requirement for egress control, we've had this in the code we put in the last edition, but we're tweaking it. You'll be allowed to use egress control if this goes through. In Group E, which is educational, and I, occupancies, you already can in business occupancies and mercantile. What these are is, I have to be very careful because I don't like this word, but they're electromagnetic locks. Oops, locks is a bad word, but what it is it secures the doors both from getting in from the outside and also getting out from the inside. Okay, these have to be tied in. There's some very specific requirements. These have to be tied into the fire alarm and sprinkler system, and they require both features. Hospital and nursing home people about it. They said, you want to know the big reason, or one of the big reasons they want them in institutional occupancies? Number one reason is for Alzheimer's patients that walk out. They don't know where they are, they'll just walk out of the building. And we're all going to get that someday. The second primary reason why they want it in hospitals is people coming in to steal babies. Putting these on the nurseries. And it's happening even here in the metro area. We're going to put them on whether we want them to or not. So let's put some reasonable regulations on it and let them do it. These are extremely expensive systems aside from automatically using a sprinkler and alarm system. It's about somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000 per door. So, we have schools with 50 doors on them. That's an expensive option, but they're willing to go there because they think they need it for security. One of the fights we've had in schools, and some of you may remember this going back to the days that you were in school, we have a problem with the teachers propping doors open between the classrooms. And I wish I had more time. I could bring the slides from Birdsville High School. And those rooms where the door was kept closed, they could have had class in there the next day. They had to dust off the tables and soot on them. But you could have held a classroom in there the next day. The doors that were left open were destroyed. I walked around with wooden wedges and I said, here's a $100,000 wooden wedge. Because every door that was propped open with a wooden wedge, you put $100,000 per family. And so we have a big problem in school. It's an ongoing hassle. And we're going to make an exception here in the code. The code says they have to be self-closing fire-rated doors right now. And we're going to put an exception in and say if the building sprinkled with quick response sprinklers, we'll exempt the requirement for fire-rated doors. We have that much confidence in the sprinkler system, primarily the QR type. And both Edina and Minnetonka were classic examples. They were a full sprinkler building. I was in both those within 2 hours after the fire. I was at Edina within an hour after the fire. And there was a light haze of smoke in that corridor, but you had no significant smoke spread in that building. Not at all. Minnetonka was a little more severe, but and that was enough to set off a dozen sprinklers, actually 11 sprinklers. But it still did not spread beyond the room's board and did not generate much smoke. It looked like about 10 smokers had lit up in the hallway. That's about all it looked like. So no significant smoke spread. So we think we can do these in sprinklers. That way it allows, with the sprinkler buildings, allow the teacher to keep the door open, you disconnect the closer. You're going to have the door open anyway, so might as well allow them to do that.
John?
Yeah.
Isn't that like kind of contradicting what uniform building code is looking for as far as exit goes? Because your walls are pretty much 2-hour rated.
Yeah, they're not, the building code hasn't made this leap yet though. They're not, they're doing it in business occupancies, office uses. They allow this, but they haven't allowed it in schools yet. They haven't allowed it in some other types of occupancies. But I think it's just a matter of time. There's a new mega high school being constructed in up in Maple Grove. They're spending $500,000 on raising the court. $500,000, $500,000. I know the sprinkler protection for that school probably didn't cost that much. Of course, they earn it. If you want you in the room putting it in, maybe did.
A little over 400,000.
What's that?
A little over 400,000.
Okay. So they're spending more on grading the corridors than they are than it would cost to sprinkle the whole building. I mean, $500,000 buy a lot of computers for the school, buy a lot of stuff for it. We think the sprinkler would give an equivalent level of protection. Personally, I'll take a sprinkler system for 1 hour construction anything. I'd trade that.
Does it?
Somewhat controversial, Bob.
Part of the discussion too was that you're probably still going to look at some kind of rating in the corridor. The idea is that the room is not going to be left unattended and open. So like in a nursing home or a hospital currently where we have a state exemption that you don't have to have a closer, but you depend on staff to close the door in case of fire in the room. That's kind of the concept here. You're still probably going to have the construction where you have fire stopping and so on. But we'll probably have to have the teacher close the door and the last person out or it's locked at night. That was kind of the theory behind it, that compartmentation still plays a role, but that sprinklers would be your first defense.
Yeah, it's really, Bob summed it up. You're turning from compartmentation being the first defense to fire protection, sprinklers being the first defense. It's kind of flip-flopping the roles between them.
John, the question back here though brings up another one that I'd like you to address, please, is, okay, when does the fire code take effect and when does the building code take effect? Because they don't do the same thing. Maybe we're going to get to that.
Some of the hardcores some of the building officials still use this. They call the fire code a maintenance code. I strongly disagree with that terminology. The fire code is not a maintenance code. The purists will tell you that the building code builds the building and the fire code maintains it in that condition. And that's not true anymore. That may have been true 20 or 30 years ago. It's not true anymore. And because of the political structure in Minnesota, the fire code applies statewide, as I mentioned before. So really the fire code has some jurisdiction in areas that the building code doesn't. There have been some court cases on conflicting codes. What do you do when one code says this and one code says that? So far the rulings of the court have been that they have to comply with both. So whichever is more restrictive is the one that fly, basically. But there is some movement with the building code on this issue in the schools. Right now, there's 9 exceptions to the graded corridor requirements of the building code. When you have a code requirement that has 9 exceptions to it, it's time to fix the code requirement. There's something wrong there. That's what we're seeing in graded corridors. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't work. And it's like everybody in this room should get a $300,000 tax break. It's a nice idea, but it ain't going to work, okay? And that's what it is with graded corridors. You can't fire rate an exit corridor, even though it's a good idea. I walk through hundreds of buildings, I've yet to see a fire rated exit corridor. As soon as somebody sees one, I'd like them to call me. But I haven't seen anything. I've seen people try to rate them, but I haven't seen it be successful. Because in a rated corridor, what are you trying to protect against? Smoke. And that takes some pretty tight construction, particularly in single-story buildings where the roof has to move independently of the walls. You tell me how you're going to get good smoke seal, especially on those corridor roofs. You can't do it. So I'm becoming very cynical on rated corridors. I have to say I don't believe in them because I don't think I can build one. Nice idea. Do it. So you have to use some other method to keep the smoke from getting out that corridor. Keep it free flash over. Keep it free flash over. Sprinkler. It's back in my early economy. That's some of the thoughts emerging from that one. There was a state legislature that was going to propose legislation that would have done the same thing this year for new buildings also. And they backed down on it with some promises that the state building code would take care of this. I see this changing over the course of the next few years, especially this sprinkler building. I'm not ready to give it up on sprinkler building. There's some other changes coming about. Probably doesn't directly affect you. Dealing with dispensing operations and fuel dispensing. I won't spend time talking about that. But there's a couple here that are going to apply, at least some of you here. That's dealing with the Article 81 on high pile combustible storage. This has been a somewhat acrimonious issue. I hold Bob James completely to blame for this one, because he was one of the first people that actually read the code here. And when he started consulting with people on how it's supposed to be done, even when he worked for the state, we found out that there's some problems with a strict application of Article 81, high pile combustible storage. Boy, you're really, that's a hardship. The first change we're going to make is we're going to exempt what we call limited area high pile combustible storage. If you have 5% of the building or 2,500 square feet and the building is sprinkled, you don't need to go through all the requirements for high pile combustible storage. That's becoming a somewhat common configuration. We're seeing Cup Foods now go to this, Sport Marts, where they have maybe one rack that gets over that threshold at 12 feet high and kicks it into high pile storage. But it's such an insignificant amount of the whole building. Technically, Article 81 says the whole building now has to comply with those requirements, or they have to be physically separated and some other things. But we're going to say, okay, if it's sprinkled, you can have up to 5% or 2,500 square feet. You don't need to separate that stock from other stock. You don't have to have the venting or the draft proof requirements in there. So that will help with very limited use. Another change is we're going to, right now it's discretionary language. We're going to make it even stronger discretionary language. There can be such a thing, but we're going to add language which allows the chief to require mechanical smoke removal systems in high pile storage. Right now it says the chief can accept that. I'm paraphrasing it, but a lot of this gets to be very technical, and a lot of fire officials aren't in a situation of being able to know whether they should accept this or not. In some cases, in the high pile storage warehouse, you may only have spring-loaded hatches that come open on the roof. Well, that works fine in the summer. It doesn't work so good this time of year. It has snow load on top of the building. And we think that mechanical are preferable to passive systems, and roof hatches are strictly passive systems. So we're going to say, okay, if the chief doesn't want to put people on the roof to open up those hatches, the chief can require mechanical smoke removal. It's a deployment issue for the fire official. A lot of paid departments are only responding, all they'll have available during the day is 5 or 10 people. That's not enough to deploy people up on a roof with a major hatch opening or expedition up there, so they require mechanical system, require mechanical smoke removal, smoke exhaust. Then the next one, which some of you will love and some of you will hate, but amend the language to allow smoke removal to be designed in accordance with the UBC standard 905, UBC 905, which is the smoke control formulas, and those of you familiar with it. If the building is protected with ESFR sprinklers. We think ESFR are preferable to standard sprinklers. We think they extinguish it faster. They extinguish it, plain and simple. It's more water and it's there faster. You have less smoke development, so therefore you can use those. We feel it's appropriate to use the smoke control design formula in 905 rather than the more prescriptive requirements that are in the code right now. This will reduce the venting requirements, the smoke removal requirements by about, most of what I've seen are you cut it in half or maybe reduce it by 2/3. So it really significantly impacts. Is that about what you've been seeing, Bob? Everything I've seen is ended up like 35% of what you would need or 40% of what you need. So it will significantly reduce the amount of venting required to use this, and we feel that strongly that we as far as we can do it. There's some talk about moving this to all sprinkler buildings. That was probably a little too much, too early. Although that movement needs to be considered in some phase on a national level. It's arguable that you need that much venting, particularly if you have an active system, an actual commissioning system. So that kind of covers the Article 81 stuff. Some changes in Appendix 1A. Appendix 1A is the one chapter in the fire code that is clearly retroactive. It's in Appendix 1A, that means every building in the state should meet it. Appendix 1A gives a lot of flexibility for sprinklers. If you have an existing building that doesn't have rated corridors, you can sprinkler it. If you have existing buildings and it's more than 3 stories in height, 3 or more stories in height, you can sprinkler it rather than separate it vertically. Lots of exceptions that are given in that. We're going to continue that. We're going to add a couple things in there. One is we're going to add language dealing with egress windows and incorporate some exceptions that the life safety code previously allowed, such as a smaller size, exiting to adjoining rooms, and also an exemption for the sprinkler, which will need egress windows in those buildings with the sprinkler. This only deals with existing. This doesn't deal with new construction, so it's flexibility for the code official. Amend item 7 dealing with occupancy separations. There, once again, give exemptions for sprinklers that aren't there in the code right now. And add a new section, number 8, dealing with separation of hazardous areas, shops, labs, boiler rooms, furnace rooms, those types of things. And add an exception for those areas of sprinklers and the requirement of fire separation. Typically, those are trade-offs that code officials use anyway. Winding down here, my last Gary Larson. Those of you in the back might not be able to see it, but there's 2 cows talking. Chicago's in the background on fire, and one cow says the other, well, it seems that Agent 6373 has accomplished the mission. Anybody have any questions?
How are you going to accomplish that, the enforcement of those inspections in rural areas where you have a volunteer fire department, volunteers working a job in a milk plant someplace?
Quite frankly, a lot of those, they never will get inspected. I'm just going to be honest about it. We will inspect on a local fire department's behalf if they request us to, but in most cases they don't, unless it's a real unique problem or a problem they call it. The lion's share of the buildings we've never been in, and probably never will be. But what is kind of interesting is there's an emerging philosophy or trend coming out of the court system that's saying regardless of whether or not a fire marshal has inspected a building, that's still the level, the standard that they're held to. So if you as a property owner are violating the fire code, you will be civilly liable if something goes wrong. That was almost unheard of a few years ago. I'm involved in 3 cases right now that are working on exactly that issue. So far, it seems like the Supreme Court has found against the property.
What they did in California, they took fire departments in larger cities that were of a certain size. They gave the fire chief or a lieutenant or better the authority of the state fire marshal. And in giving him that responsibility, he also had the responsibility to do this inspection. And about half of them took this responsibility. The others said, we can't enforce something like it. We don't have the personnel. Yeah, but you're responsible for this here. They said, well.
And our problem is some of this is getting so technical and so involved now that it's difficult for a part-time person to do this, and we're finding a lot of fire departments are getting out of it. They're saying it's over our head. We're either going to do it and do it right, or they're not going to do it at all. So we see a lot of them are steps back. They may have, in the past, done a courtesy inspection, which is more a walkthrough for obvious hazards, but now they're saying this is getting so technical. We can't do some of this. They can't. I can't keep up with the alarm technology. I can hardly keep up with the sprinkler technology. I really feel sorry for somebody that does that on a part-time basis. They're really behind.
In regards to maintenance and inspection again, with the state licensing law, there are licensed sprinkler contractors and sprinkler fitter technicians inspecting these systems. Is that going to trickle down to the alarm and detection?
Yeah, well, that's even in state law now. That's in separate state law, Chapter 326, I believe. The alarm and communication contract. Right now, you have to be a state licensed either electrician or alarm and communication contractor to maintain the system. That's been in there since 89? Literally in 88? Yes, that actually preceded our sprinkler license requirements.
What kind of timeline?
As I said, we're writing the statement of need and reasonableness, which is one of the last steps, and now we're publishing what's called the state register, that's kind of a legal one. And all these changes will be published in here, and the public will have a chance to comment. We go on what's called a dual track, and that's that if nobody requests a hearing, basically nobody objects to the rule, they will go into force. It's either 30 or 60 days. So I think it's 30 days after the publication is done. Then they're going to force. If 25 people or more request a hearing, it will automatically drive it into a hearing, and then we can bring it before an administrative law judge, and then the law judge will move the ruling, and so that slows the process down by several months. Obviously, we're hoping we get by without a hearing. We've only been able to get by without a hearing once, so it's not probably not a real good possibility. If you happen to like something that you saw in here, please don't send a letter requesting that we go to hearing. Okay? No matter what the reason is to go to hearing, if it says I want it to go to a hearing, then we have to treat that as one of the 25 letters. Even if you say, I think this is the greatest thing since Palm Air Science Board, please go to a hearing. You can't destroy those letters, you have to honor that. 25 signatures now is not difficult with fax machines and word processors. I'm sure somebody can generate 25 letters at a time on hand. That's why if there's something particularly objectionable to a group here or your industry, let us know now. If you try to fix it, we try to fix it before we go through a hearing process. Don't take us on some dictate, but it is an impact. No, we're hoping for this year yet. Typically, after you get it in the state register, it starts to clip off pretty fast. It's like 30-day windows. So it can happen in like 60 or 90 days after it's published. So it could be as soon as June or July. We'll go to a hearing and then maybe just follow. all bets are off. It's out of our control. Other than we have to defend those. Right now, the state of New reasonable us. After we get that done, we can publish any time. We want to have our committee look it over one last time and make sure that we fit on all the issues that have been discussed. Didn't miss something, didn't do something wrong. So that's a fairly short. We'll send to everybody and say, let us know what the problems are here. By next Friday, keep on those problems. It's putting stuff together that's all the work.
Just a note, I know she had some of these extra copies running around.
Yeah.
It's all about, so I'd like to take those and
Yeah, have at 'em.
mail them out to Region 15 members.
Have a copy to your heart's content. Steal them, plagiarize them. If you sell them, give me a little credit for it. You just give them a little free, no problem. No money, no money. I'm not allowed to take any money. They got ethics laws.
Anybody else?
Yeah, me again. I noticed on some projects where local building officials have waived the requirement for attic sprinklers in some 3- and 4-story multiple housing units. I was just wondering if there's anything...
That is actually, that showed up in the 94 building code, and it's going to show up in the 94 fire code, which will allow the use of the 13R systems we use. And also, with the 13R, you can waive, I call it the non-habitable space or non-occupied space like the attics. When you do that, you don't get any of the other code trade-offs. You don't get allowable area increases because of sprinkler and all this other stuff. But they are permitted by the building code now. And if they have the optional appendix, 1306 used to be the old appendix E and appendix 38, and now it's something like that. I call it the 1306 because that's a rule that's in now. You've been allowed to do that already. Those are allowed to trade off the non-habitable space. So you're going to see more of that. There is a movement towards the 13R systems, but you don't get any other code trade-offs when you do that. The fire official can't trade off access rules and all that other stuff. It's kind of questionable whether that's cost effective now. If all you're saving is a dry valve, which is the price of installation of that, you're probably going to eat that up with an access rule and a couple more fire hydrants. You might as well hold a full-blown system. Compliant 13 system for quick response residential hits and right by the head. You accomplish the same thing. That was we've already, I need to be kind of honest about this. Frankly, when you read the statistics, I believe in 13R systems. They're protecting the area where fires are starting. We're not having fires starting in the attics except by lightning strikes, in which case it burns off the roof whether it's sprinkled or not. So, as long as you're getting sprinkler protection where the fires are starting where people are at, because fires start because people do stupid things. 65% of our fires are carelessness, 30% of them are arson. That only leaves 5% to everything else. So let's protect the ones being intentional set. Let's protect against the ones doing something stupid. So we lose a few. We lose the other percentage of their life. That's not bad. That's not bad risk management. So, one last I want to leave you with before I go, a little bit about the Breezy Point, for some of you that might be interested in that. That is a fully sprinkled building that burned. Got a little bit of a black eye, I think, initially on it, but they were questions raised about how a sprinkled building could catch fire. They had half-sawn logs on the outside for decoration, and an outside refrigeration compressor, the lead was caught fire, and ignited the wood on the outside of the building and traveled up, and got onto the roof and went across. And so the fire was all outside the building. The sprinklers did activate, but when the roof was sprinklers not working, but not supported with it anymore. And once the roof came down, both alarm and sprinkler systems were activated. Fire was above them. So we tried to get that word out to try to get people to really get more worked up about that.
What building was that?
That's Breezy Point, the main lodge, the main convention center. Other one, the Golden State. Oh, yeah. I wasn't up to that one personally. I got a lot of meetings for more than I want.
Anybody else? Well, thanks, Jen, I appreciate it. And thank you all for attending, and hopefully we'll see you next month.